morning to our friends in Washington and the US. Good evening to our friends in the Arab world, and good afternoon to everybody in between. Welcome to this virtual event co-hosted by two Atlantic Council centers, the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East and the Digital Forensics Research Lab. My name is Tuqa Nusayrat. I'm the Deputy Director of our Middle East initiatives. We're delighted that you could join us for today's discussion. 10 years ago, brave protesters in many parts of the Arab world defied long-standing perceptions and took to the streets, calling for much-needed economic reforms and an end to oppressive regime structures that limited their ability to unlock their fullest potential. The protesters leveraged a new tool, social media networks, to share grievances, organize and mobilize demonstrators, and hold leaders publicly accountable. While some observers were quick to dub them social media revolutions, regional experts pointed out that social media was just one avenue for expressing long-standing frustrations that could not be vocalized in other spaces. Over the past decade, these social media platforms have changed dramatically. Their users have grown exponentially, and autocratic governments have developed quick responses to squeeze and regulate the online space for a number of reasons. Questions have also been raised about social media platforms engaging in forms of censorship, sometimes in response to government requests, as well as their regulation or less than regulation of disinformation and hate speech. So social media has become noisier than ever, with targeted campaigns that often amplify extreme voices, drowning out organic discussions and debates that were the hallmark and the highlight of some of these platforms. Here at the Rafiq Hariri Center, we've been tracking the developments in the region for the past 10 years and the changes that we've seen in the Middle East in the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, which have impacted the region's security, economy, and politics and society in many ways. My colleagues at the Digital Forensics Research Lab, which was established in 2016, work to identify, expose, and explain disinformation where and when it occurs using open source research. In today's discussion, we're going to talk about the changes that have occurred in this online space in the Middle East over the past decade. Without taking up too much time, we're going to have a great panel. Let me go ahead and introduce them. I'll be posing questions to them for the first half, and then we'll take your questions. So please use the Q&A feature throughout the event to drop your questions. And if you're watching us in one of our live streams on YouTube or Twitter, we welcome you to tweet your questions to us using the hashtag #ACMidEast. Let me start with my colleague, Andy Carvin. We've been working closely together to conceptualize this event. Andy is a resident senior fellow and managing editor at the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab, where he leads the lab's training and capacity building efforts. Andy is an award-winning journalist who pioneered new forms of online collaboration for more than 20 years. From 2006 to 2013, Andy was a senior strategist at NPR, where he founded the company's social media desk and developed new reporting techniques to improve the quality and diversity of NPR's journalism. And during the course of 2011 and 2012, he became known as the man who tweets revolutions due to his innovative coverage of the Arab Spring using social media. In early 2013, Andy released a book, Distant Witness: Social Media, the Arab Spring, and a Journalism Revolution. Interestingly, for those who are in Washington, his work has been featured at the Smithsonian Museum of American History, where you can find the iPhone that he used to cover the Arab Spring as part of its permanent exhibit on the history of American innovation. Thanks, Andy, for working with us on this event. Let me shoot you the first question. Let's think about going back to your experience covering the Arab Spring a decade ago. Can you highlight some of the most significant ways the platforms and their users have changed?
Well, if you think back 10 years ago, in some ways it feels like a much more innocent time, particularly from the perspective of activists who wanted to experiment with these platforms and see how they could mobilize with them. Largely because most of the governments that were involved or targeted during the Arab Spring simply didn't have the experience or the understanding with how these tools could be used for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and for organizing. And so for the better part of 2011, you saw Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, a number of alternative platforms successfully being used to organize events, to share footage that was otherwise being suppressed, and to get the word out both regionally and internationally. What you didn't see much of at the time, though, was a well organized governments using these tools to suppress the protesters. In most cases, when suppression took place, it was through brute force. It was through the day of rage that happened on January 28th, 2011 in Cairo, or the shootings that happened in Kasserine in Tunis, or in Tunisia. And of course, we saw how things got extremely violent both in Libya and in Syria as time went by. And so, for the most part, governments didn't really know what to do with these tools. But having said that, there were aspects of it that you could see beginning to happen. For one thing, if you look back a few years before that, during the 2009 protests in Iran, while protesters were very well organized using social media, you could also make the case that the Iranian government was very well organized at pushing back and monitoring it. During 2011, with the Arab Spring, really the only government that you saw emulating that effectively was Bahrain. Bahrain is a very wired country. People had access to broadband back then. Many leading political figures were active on social media. And so, unlike other places where governments would use blunt force instruments such as shutting off the internet as really the only way to respond online. Instead, in Bahrain, you would see things such as organized campaigns to paint protesters as terrorists, cyberbullying, very coordinated messaging taking place. In many ways, it was a taste of things to come later on in what we've observed more recently in Saudi Arabia, and in the many types of disinformation campaigns that we've seen take place all around the world. And so, like I said, in some ways, social media felt a lot more innocent at that point, even though there were already signs that it could be used in very oppressive ways.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, let me jump to Rasha. Dr. Rasha Abdullah is a professor in the Journalism and Mass Communication Department at the American University in Cairo. Abdullah's current research and interests include media and transition, media uses and effects, new media, social media and political participation, and freedom of expression. Her doctoral dissertation was the first large-scale academic study of the uses and gratification of the internet among Arab students in Egypt. She's the author of numerous publications on the use of social media in Egypt and the Arab world, and you could find her detailed bio on our website. Asha, thank you for joining us today. Let me ask you, 10 years ago, social media, like Andy was saying, provided a space for free-flowing discussion that wasn't available in other parts of the region. We know regimes eventually caught on and began to restrict these platforms, sometimes through legal mechanisms such as emergency laws, cyber laws. How did the social media space evolve in response to these changes?
That's an interesting question. Thank you for having me, first of all. It's interesting to see how the space was then and how it is now, and it's very, very different. When I look at my Twitter timeline, it's completely different. The Asians, the people who are tweeting are different. The content is different. The spirit is different. It's just a very, very different space. And as Andy pointed out, the thing is, at the time, governments either did not catch up or they didn't really think it was important. I mean, one of the jokes coming out of the Mubarak regime was when he said, let the kids play with the internet. For a long time, this was just the impression that this is some kind of a game that they have, some kind of a toy, and just let them play with it. Nothing's going to come of it. Up until the string of revolutions that broke all over the Arab world, and now where we're at. So as you correctly pointed out, there has been a string of legislation trying to control this space. Interestingly, actually, under Mubarak, in Egypt, for example, we were under emergency laws, but it's just that they really didn't care about this particular space. They didn't think that anything serious would come out of it, and they just let people enjoy it as it was. And I don't think people strategically, sat down and said, okay, so we have this space. How do we now create a revolution? I mean, nobody thought this way. It's just, things evolved on their own. And today, now that the governments know what can come out of the internet, they're not, letting this space go as freely as it once was. How are the platforms reacting? I don't think they're. I mean, it's a matter of just the whole space being shut down, the whole space being closed. I mean, as I said, the agents who are enforcing any kind of change, the people who are tweeting, for example, have by and large disappeared. Really, either some of them are in prison, some of them is in self exile, some of them are afraid to speak out. And the spirit is just different. So the topics to talk about and the possible consequences of what you're going to say online are now so grave that very few people are willing to speak out, and they're not really seeing any possible outcome of their talk. I mean, even if they were to take the risk, I don't think there's a feeling that anything would come out of this at this point. And so the nature of the whole space is now very, very different. I would argue that the internet created not just a virtual public sphere, but actual literal public space in the streets of the Arab world. And when that public sphere, when that virtual sphere was controlled or is shrinking, basically, as every day as we speak, with the shrinking of that space, the shrinking of the public spaces came along. I mean, you can't really argue like which caused. I mean, it's a vicious circle kind of, but there is definitely a big correlation, in my opinion, between just shutting off this virtual space and shutting off the possible public spaces in the Arab world.
And do you think, I mean, those are important points. You said, they're kind of, those spaces are no longer existent. Do you think that people are trying to find different spaces, or it's just on hold? These discussions are just going to be on hold for now, or they go underground as they did before 2011, or it's just like you said, it's not worth the risk right now because the return is so low?
I think people always try to find, space. It's just that everybody's very tired. So again, I don't think somebody's sitting down right now planning like, okay, how do we create, the next wave of revolutions? Everybody's exhausted, is exhausted even of political talk, let alone organizing or mobilizing anything. But that's not to say that, that they're not looking for space all the time, or that when that space becomes available, they're not going to take advantage of it, because I mean, the users are not the ones who always have the chance to create the space. I mean, the virtual spaces are created by major platforms, right? So there's at the time of the Arab Spring, it was Facebook and Twitter. These were the two virtual spaces or two biggest platforms, and YouTube, of course, before that, and blogging before that. Now there are all types of new platforms. There's TikTok, there's Instagram before that. There's TikTok is just coming along and becoming very popular in Egypt. Now there's Clubhouse. There are other spaces coming to existence, and they're coming to existence by major corporations, not by users. So it's not the users who have the power to create these spaces, but it is the user who has the power to make sense out of the space and sort of turn that space into an actual public sphere. through the conversations. I would think that people are exhausted, but that's not to say that, if they see an opportunity. Again, I don't think even the Arab Spring was created through people like intentionally deliberating on, okay, when do we create a revolution? I mean, it just, there's momentum that was built up, and it happened. And so at this particular moment, people are definitely exhausted, but who knows in the future when a space comes along, what would happen. It's people are always looking for chances, and momentums could always be built up again.
Yeah, no, for sure. Important point. I love that you're calling us from Cairo. We can feel Cairo in the background. Let me jump to Borzu. Borzu is one of our non-resident fellows here at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He's also a journalist and a foreign correspondent who's been covering the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe for more than 16 years. Borzu Daragahi is now based in Istanbul and writing for The Independent. He has previously written for BuzzFeed News, Financial Times, Los Angeles Times, contributed to a number of other publications as well. He covered the 2003 invasion of Iraq and its buildup and aftermath. He also covered the war in Lebanon in 2006, the 2009 uprising in Iran, and of course the 2011 uprisings in the Middle East. He has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist 3 times and has received the Overseas Press Club honors for Iraq and Iran coverage. Thanks, Borzu, for joining us today. I want to take a step back a little bit. Before the Arab Spring, you were mentioning that there were revolutions that relied heavily on social media, more specifically on YouTube in Myanmar and Kyrgyzstan. Tell us a little bit more about that and how it may have informed some of the experience of the Arab Spring activists.
I'm not sure it informed. I think maybe the experience of Iran in 2009 might have popularized a template that was that predated even Iran. That you had a repressive regime in Myanmar. You had a 2007 uprising. You had absolute harsh media censorship in that country, and the activists and protesters were able to evade that censorship by filming themselves, essentially acting as citizen journalists, uploading the YouTube videos, and then having those, and I think this is key, this is important, in the case of Myanmar, in the case of Iran, it was important, in the case of Kyrgyzstan, it was important as well, having those images that they uploaded being beamed back to them via BBC and other channels and so on, so that people in the country would know that this is going on, and you're breaking the wall of silence, you're breaking the wall of fear, you're showing your fellow country people, as well as the world, which is an important part, but showing your fellow country people that this is happening, that these people are out on the streets, come and join us. And I think that's the template that was created by the Arab Spring. But I think that is like the kind of confusion as well, because in the beginning of these uprisings, there is this tendency to fixate on the YouTube angle or the Twitter angle and so on, and not on the fact that this YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. are just like one extra, perhaps key component of a much more important thing. And the fact is that people are out on the streets protesting against the authoritarian regime. So I think that there was a confusion on the part of journalists in the beginning that, YouTube revolution, this wasn't a YouTube revolution. YouTube was just the way in which the one aspect of the dictatorial regime was undermined. The more important aspect was the organizing aspect, was the fact that people were out on the streets and so on. And I think that question as to why it's important that why does it even matter that people are tweeting about something that's happening on the street? I think that's a question worth asking. Why is it important at all that people are filming themselves and putting that on YouTube and putting that on YouTube and uploading it? And then isn't it much more important that people are out there on the streets and people have organized themselves, have managed to overcome the fear of truncheons and machine guns and torture in prisons in going out there and so on. So I think that is like one of the things that was sort of lost in those initial hazy days of the Arab uprisings, as well as the uprising in Iran and so on. And later on, it became clearer that actually the really important part of these uprisings is not the fact that they're filming themselves, is the fact that they're organizing themselves. And without that key organization, without that street level, ground level kind of structure in place, the revolution will fizzle out and will fail. To some extent, and I would love to hear what Russia says about this. I was there, during this time. We know each other from like those days, those early years, and so on. I've quoted you in stories before. I don't know if you remember, but I think that's one of the reasons why the Egyptian uprising kind of became a victim of its own initial success, among other reasons, is that like this lesson wasn't learned. That like actually, what's really important is that you hold on to the square, start building a political organization out of that, and so on, and not just get caught up in the, I hate to use the word glamour, but like for want of a better word, the sort of the glamour of the YouTube, Twitter aspect of it, the kind of showbiz aspect of it, and concentrate on the fact of concentrate as they did in, for example, Algeria. And Tunisia as well, like building ties between those people in the streets and the labor unions that were, a key component of both the Egyptian and Tunisian and Algerian uprisings, more recent Algerian uprising. And so anyway, I think it's worthwhile to talk about that kind of basic ontological question. Why does it even matter that people are filming themselves doing something that's much more incredible than the fact that they're filming themselves?
Thanks, George. You raised a number of important questions. I mean, we could definitely be here all day answering them, but I think one of the most important things is that, social media and the reliance on social media grew out of the need because the traditional media was either suppressed or controlled by government forces. So people may have been protesting, but nobody would cover it. This is, one of the reasons why it became such an important tool, because people were, became citizen journalists. Andy knows a lot about this. But in terms of what you just said about, why is it really important? Why is social media really important? And a lot of people, are critical of social media. Is it a bubble that doesn't really represent public opinion? Is this an issue particular to the region, or is it across, is an issue across social media platforms around the world? Sometimes people said, pro-democracy and revolutionary activists were mostly Western educated. They tweeted in English. They were upper middle class, and they tweeted to a specific audience. Has that changed? Tell me a little bit more, whether it's you or anybody else on the panel who wants to address that.
I'll just say very quickly that a lot of hardcore activists, as well as hardcore jihadis and hardcore, right-wing extremists in the West, have moved to different, like much less public platforms. They've gone underground. I was actually on a panel with you earlier when we were talking about this, the sort of rise of Telegram and private Telegram channels, the use of encrypted communications and so on. So I think, I don't think in 2011, when you would reach out to an activist, they would immediately, and they say it in two different messages, SIG, and then the next one, NAL, i.e., tag me on Signal and we'll talk there. So I think there's a lot more cloak and dagger aspect to how activists and others who are using social media, there's a lot more caution, a lot more, as Andy was saying, just like the innocent era is gone.
I remember a couple of months after the Tunisian revolution ended, I spoke with a Tunisian colleague that I'd known for several years prior to the revolution. And I as I was talking to them, I asked them why they used their real name on both Facebook and on Twitter while they were participating. And at the time they said, well, I don't know if we're going to be successful or not, but either way, I want my name on the record as to where I stood on this. And it was very powerful, and it was extraordinary to hear that from them. But I I'd really love to go back to Tunis and ask them if this were happening today, particularly if they were in another country, because Tunisia, relatively speaking, turned out okay. Again, relatively speaking, but if you look at other people who consider themselves activists or aspiring activists, you don't see that enthusiasm of putting their names out there on the record anymore. They're much more likely to be operating under pseudonyms. They're much more likely to insist on communicating using private messaging systems. And in some ways, I think they were late to the game. I think some people felt so strongly about doing this in the public sphere that as more and more people were forced into exile or were arrested and jailed, it became clear to a lot of people that it's simply not possible to operate in a public manner as the affordances of social media once offered, and that if they want to continue these conversations, even just to reminisce about them, let alone to continue organizing, they have to use encrypted peer-to-peer encryption in order to do that safely.
I think you raised an important point there as well about, let's talk about a little bit more about disinformation and the bad actors that quickly became part of these platforms. The response time by bad actors, whether they are corporations or individuals and movements or governments, it's significantly diminished. How does that impact the use of social media by activists now? And you were saying people were able to use their names at the time. It's almost as I heard in another panel recently, people don't want their tweets to go viral anymore like they did a long time ago.
Yeah,
They would
exactly.
rather not. They would rather not.
Yeah, well, disinformation has gotten really complicated. I think the first examples I saw of it in any sort of organized fashion back in 2011 were actually bots that were set up by supporters of the Syrian government that were, every time someone used the hashtag Syria, it would send out another tweet that would talk about Syrian tourism, like come taste our olives. Or it would show the latest sports scores for a football match that had happened that week. And so these were crude methods, and they weren't disinformation in the sense that the information that was shared was incorrect, and they were real sports scores. But at the same time, it was an attempt to flood the information space with noise. And so, and in that period of time, people were following hashtags to keep up with what was going on. And so, by having a bunch of tweets, one after another, talking about Syrian tourism and football scores, what made it harder for those of us who wanted to keep up on things. Flash forward a few years, and you start seeing campaigns that are much more sophisticated, where it's not just simply creating bots, but creating entire messaging plans in terms of how you want to undermine the opposition or undermine individual dissenters. If you just go back and look at the history of how, for example, Saudi Arabia used Twitter in particular, but other networks as well, to crack down on folks like Jamal Khashoggi. These weren't necessarily bots. In fact, these were, in many cases, real humans acting as trolls and turning out alternate narratives that, in many cases, were not based on any type of fact whatsoever. And so the types of propaganda that you would have previously seen being spread in an offline environment were now being amplified in online environments. And so disinformation slowly but surely got more sophisticated. And I think certainly after the 2016 election in the US, and after the world got to observe how the Internet Research Agency in Russia successfully turned Americans on each other through fake accounts and creating divisive narratives and divisive events, that essentially the cat was out of the bag at that point. And it lowered the barrier for almost anyone to engage in disinformation campaigns, including domestic opponents. Who might not have the backing of a government or the money to create a sophisticated campaign, but had the social media chops to amplify messaging that would run counter to democratic movements.
You wrote last year about a very organized campaign for-profit campaigns, disinformation campaigns. You wrote about one example in Tunisia last year. Can you tell
Yes.
us a little bit more about that?
So one thing we've observed in recent years is the not, I don't know if it's really the increase, because this might have been taking place behind the scenes and we just weren't as aware of it back then. But we've been able to spot more and more examples of private firms, commercial businesses that work in digital communications, PR, and the like, offering services that are essentially running disinformation campaigns. And in this particular case, we identified a Tunis-based company that ran plenty of legitimate PR campaigns as well, but we also uncovered that they had set up fake networks of news Facebook pages, like news in quotes because they weren't actual news outlets. In some cases, they created fake fact-checking pages that claimed to be monitoring for fake information or monitoring corruption by politicians, but it was all essentially it was all a fraud, in the sense that the people that were running it weren't activists, or they weren't corruption monitors. They were people who worked for a private firm. And so in Togo and Cote d'Ivoire and a number of other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they were engaged in supporting certain political candidates. And then eventually we were able to trace them to supporting one particular candidate who ran for president in Tunisia, unsuccessfully, but they ended up being a finalist. And so since then, we've seen many, many other examples where private firms have offered themselves as disinformation hired guns, whether to run networks of fake accounts or to develop messaging and the like. And there's really no good way to get a sense of what the scale is of this, and how much money is being spent on this, who's paying them to do it. There was a takedown that Facebook engaged in about a year ago, in which they removed a number of pages that they traced to the UAE and Egypt, a company that referred to itself as New Waves, and they were running coordinated, inauthentic campaigns that supported the policy goals of the UAE, but doesn't necessarily mean that we can prove that the UAE as a government was behind it. And so one of the big mysteries that I think a lot of researchers in disinformation are trying to sort out again and again and again are who are the individual or the entities that are behind these things. Are these politicians that have money in the bank to pay for advancing their own ambitions, or is it done by people who have a chance to benefit from a new person coming in, or is it a government itself? The answer is, honestly, in a lot of cases, we just don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. I think you guys are doing such a great job at tracking these campaigns, and I encourage everybody to check out the Digital Forensics Research Lab's work on Medium and on our website. I want to go to Russia and ask you a question about control of social media platforms. Governments alone do have a hard time limiting the role of social media just by themselves. I mean, they do have a number of tools at their disposal, but the role of social media platforms as well in controlling some of these critical voices and narratives, they played a role in that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of these platforms and how that played out in the region?
Yeah, that's really a very important issue, because I mean, you'd expect a repressive regime to obviously want to repress voices on social media, but you wouldn't expect the platforms to be a player onto that, and that's a big problem, because I think the platforms have increasingly been a factor in this process. So it's not just the governments; it's the governments and the major companies, the major platforms. We've seen as early as, I think it was 2007, we've seen, for example, YouTube take down the account of Wael Abbas, who was one of the more prominent Egyptian bloggers at the time, and his account had like an aggregation of videos of police brutality and things of the sort, his account was just shut down, and that's in way back in 2007. More recently, we've seen accounts being suspended by Facebook. We've seen accounts being suspended by Twitter. Like a year ago, Twitter suspended over 60 accounts. These are the ones that someone, an activist, managed to count through no strategic effort. I mean, or no systematic effort to actually find out the aggregate number of accounts that were affected. But quite a number of accounts were suspended in a matter of days, and like 2 weeks later, Twitter just came out and said, we're sorry, we made a mistake. And this is just unacceptable. More recently, we've been observing something else, which is, I think, equally alarming. We've been observing accounts that just have very low reach all of a sudden for no apparent reason. My own Twitter account is suffering from this problem. So over the last maybe a couple of years or something, my Twitter follower record, for example, seems to hit a particular number and then just drop like 20 to 30 followers, and then go back up to hit that number and then drop again 20 to 30 followers. And so basically I've been static for about 2 years now. It's not an issue of me wanting followers. It's just an issue of tweeting about things that seem to be quite important and quite controversial. Whereas, a couple of years ago, you would get a lot of reaction to it, a lot of people replying, people responding, people tagging you or tagging others or mentioning you. And now it's like nothing. It's like I'm tweeting in a vacuum, and that's more alarming for quite a few reasons. First of all, there's no way for the end user to document this for a fact. So, if my account gets suspended, that's it. It's a fact of life. My account got suspended. Everybody can see that. If my account is kind of muzzled, that's much more difficult to show to people. I mean, I can say that, and people can say, oh, she just wants more followers, or oh, she just wants more, exposure on Twitter. But I've been studying social media for close to 20 years, so I think I have a feeling for what's happening. And when I started talking to people in international NGOs and things like that, I started hearing that this is not an uncommon complaint anymore. People are coming around saying, look, my account is muzzled, I can't reach anybody, I don't know what's happening. That's a very dangerous, I think, tactic, if it is one. Of course, I have no way of knowing whether it's done systematically or not, whether it's done even intentionally or not. At the time when these Twitter accounts were suspended, I was one of many people who spoke against Twitter on Twitter. I don't know if that was a factor or not. I have no idea. I cannot say for sure. But I can tell you for a fact that my tweets have been getting less and less exposure. How is that happening? Why is that happening? We don't seem to know. And I'm certain that I'm not the only one. So now several NGOs are starting to just, figure out, okay, how big is the scale this has been going on? Is it going on only on Twitter or on Facebook? It seems to be on Facebook as well. How does it happen? When does it happen? How are the platforms? I mean, the one thing that we know for sure is, I think we can all agree on, is these platforms have all now become extremely powerful, much more powerful than any of us had expected, or that any of us would have probably liked. I mean, it's becoming, Facebook and Twitter and I think Instagram is less political to a lesser extent. That doesn't make it any less important, by the way, because there are other issues. The issues do not all have to be political. But at least for platforms of that major scale to be that much in control of how much a person, and I don't really like the word activist very much, because who's an activist and who's not, but just any end user who has something to say, who wants to say something, and wants to put it out there in the public sphere, for a platform of some sort to have the power to say, okay, you can have an account, your account is suspended, your account is muzzled, you will get 5% exposure, you will get 2% exposure, you will get no exposure, with algorithms that we know nothing about. That's pretty serious. And I think we need to pressure these platforms to have a lot more transparency than they do now, to tell us exactly how these decisions are being made, based on what are these decisions being made, and what are the basic factors that get into that. And what can we do about it? I think that's a major issue that needs to be taken into consideration, for the reasons that I mentioned, but also for it's very difficult to combat a repressive regime. There are ways of doing it, but it's very difficult, and it comes at a humongous cost. I think it's a little more feasible, at least it should be, to try to argue with the platforms, because there's no reason why a particular platform would be able to have that much control over the public sphere, or to have that much control over what a person can say or cannot say. At the very least, we have to push for a lot of transparency on the part of these platforms. We need to know what decisions are being made, how are they being made, what kind of basic rules are these algorithms following, to give us the effect that we're seeing at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think, the monetization of some of these platforms over the past, several years, which wasn't as popular in the beginning, is a huge role. So, maybe you should consider promoting some of your tweets, Rasha, and then Twitter will push them up. But yeah, they're not democratic platforms. They're not, they are for-profit platforms. So that's an issue that we have to grapple with. One point
not being for profit is a given, but the problem is not just being for profit. The problem is if you start muzzling somebody who says something that you don't like. You, in this case, not just being a government, you being the platform. That's a bigger problem, because we have no idea what kind of a relationship do the platforms have with the governments. And so for the platforms to have that kind of power is just it's just plain wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah. I have one more question for Borzu and Andy, and I'll go to Andy first, because Rasha's points remind us of some of the recent events that we've had to grapple with here in the U.S., the use of social media in the lead up to the January 6th storming of the Capitol to galvanize the Stop the Steal movement. Tell us a little bit about how if anything changed in terms of how we see social media as being used by pro-democratic versus anti-democratic forces.
Well, in some ways, it's somewhat ironic that almost 10 years exactly to the day of the Arab Spring beginning in late December 2010, people started organizing Stop the Steal protests and rallies around the country, in which they embraced a demonstrable falsehood. And that falsehood being that Trump had somehow won the election, and used it to rally all sorts of types of individuals who didn't want to see a Biden administration come in. And early on, when Stop the Steal began in earnest over the last election, back in last September, give or take, a lot of it was very much focused on making the argument that there is no legitimate way for Biden to win the election, and therefore, if Trump loses, by definition, that has to be illegitimate. And so they, from the get-go, they started organizing groups on Facebook and elsewhere. They started organizing rallies and bus tours, essentially, where they would go from one town to another and have events and report on where they were going next, to whip up as many individuals as possible to buy into the big lie that Trump had actually won. And as that went forward, other individuals and other groups began championing similar messages, whether it was people in QAnon, or lots of domestic extremist groups started backing the same messaging. And so as the months went by, you saw this convergence of groups that had potentially somewhat different goals, but still had a reason to buy into the shared narrative that Trump could be the only legitimate option. And that all culminated with the attack on the Capitol, the insurrection on January 6th. And our team actually we'd been monitoring and putting together a daily review of things that of things that were going on, particularly among extremist groups, going all the way back to September. And we eventually went and put together a social media timeline, if you will, to see how Stop the Steal evolved, and how domestic extremist messages converged with that, culminating with January 6th. And I think because uh, it's it's very hard in a country where free speech and free assembly is so fundamental to our culture, uh, it's very hard to crack down, at least before January 6th, to say, well, people are making an anti-democratic argument, but it's their right to make an anti-democratic argument. Things obviously have changed in the sense when people began engaging in violence, and in what now appears to be quite coordinated violence in a number of forms, and which is why previously we didn't see, for example, President Trump's Twitter account was not suspended prior to January 6th, even though uh, uh, one could have made the argument that he had violated rules on numerous occasions by posting disinformation, and by potentially inciting violence. But it wasn't until actual violence took place that most platforms finally started being more rigorous in how they started taking down individual accounts or groups of accounts. And so we're now in this somewhat awkward period where thankfully there isn't violence taking place right now. There hasn't been really since January 6th, but you have social media platforms asking themselves the question: is there a time in which things have settled down long enough that we allow Trump back on the platform? In fact, we had the CEO of YouTube recently on a conversation here at the Atlantic Council in a Zoom chat similar to this, in which she discussed that they have a three strikes you're out policy, and that up till now, President Trump has one strike. And so, that raises a lot of questions on how a platform makes the determination of what counts for permanent banishment from their platform. And then once it happens, what do you do when this great scattering takes place, as we saw after January 6th, in which many people who were kicked off platforms moved to alternate platforms such as Parler and Gab, and then Parler got shut down, and Gab's been having challenges too. A lot of these people are now moving to private messaging apps such as Signal. And while on the one hand, it's extremely important that the public have access to end-to-end encryption to engage in conversations without interference, it means that a lot of conversations that were once taking place in a very public fashion are now happening so far behind the scenes. It's sometimes very hard to know exactly what's going on.
Thanks, Andy. I want to get to some of the questions from our audience. One of them is, where do you see an opportunity to create a new outlet, platform, or model? In other words, a disruption of the Al Jazeera / Al Arabiya on one side, and the out-of-control, misinformation-laden, user-generated yet manipulated content. And I want to also ask you guys if you've been tracking Clubhouse, and if there's anything new about this platform that you think would be relevant, especially for the Middle East. I know there's been a few articles and discussions about how it may be, a new way for people in the region to discuss things away from some of the coordinated efforts, but those could be coming soon. And this question is for anybody in terms of the future of what the prospects for a new platform. Okay. I mean, I think I'll pitch in a little bit and say that I've been listening in on a number of rooms on Clubhouse. A lot of people are saying this is are finding it useful because it's not as staged as it is on Twitter, where you have to actually type out your comments, and it's much more organic. Right now, it's very limited in terms of the accessibility. Only iOS users can use it, but it has kind of excited people because it's allowed individuals to come together in rooms to talk about a variety of issues, not just political issues, but social ones as well, and in a way that's not not controlled as much and not invaded yet by some of the bad actors, I guess you could say. Let me see other questions that we have here.
One thing I'll just jump in on that regarding Clubhouse in particular. A couple of my colleagues have been writing specifically about Clubhouse and how it's been used in China over the last month, and obviously not the same region. But one thing that I thought was interesting about their observations is that there was essentially a brief period of time where internet users or Clubhouse users in mainland China were able to interact with other Chinese people around the world to talk about what was happening back in mainland China. And so there was this very brief period of several weeks where people were able to engage openly, and then the government started clamping down on access. But what's interesting is while those conversations were taking place, you would also see Communist Party propaganda being parroted by individuals. And so even by having a completely open environment for that brief amount of time, you still have a history of people being exposed again and again to certain types of narratives and messaging that become conventional wisdom, even if they're not necessarily based in truth. And so simply by providing open access to a new platform doesn't necessarily guarantee that everyone is suddenly going to be open and intellectually honest about what they're experiencing, even though that clearly blossomed for a brief amount of time. So it's just providing access to something new without censorship isn't necessarily going to answer every question we always have.
For sure. Another question we have is, what do we know about how some of these social media companies are being pressured by governments to do these takedowns and reduce visibility in order to maintain access to a specific market?
We don't know anything. That's why it's dangerous, really, and it's a very important question. But that is why there is a problem, because we know very little, if anything. I'm pretty sure the platforms will deny it straight out, which is why it needs a coordinated effort on the part of international NGOs to try, maybe in closed conversations, to get the platforms to tell us a little bit about what's happening, because otherwise it's just we have very little information, and obviously the algorithms are top secret. They're not, platforms are not gonna say much about that, but at the very least, I mean, there have been initiatives like, for example, the Ranking Digital Rights Initiative, which kind of encourages the platforms to be more transparent about their relationships with the governments. But we need a lot more of that, because it's what we have now is definitely not enough.
Social media platforms have. Go ahead, Lorzu.
Some governments are pretty open about pressuring. I think China has been pretty open about the pressure it puts on various social media outlets. Russia has been pretty explicit. Turkey is putting pressure on all the social media outlets. If you want to operate in Turkey and make money off it, and it's a key thing that they make. If you want to make money off, if you want to sell ads here, if you want to have native advertising here, you have to have a representative office here, which in a way seems fair enough. I think they didn't. It's not like PayPal, where the Turkish government demanded that they include the servers, servers inside the country. That was a kind of potential breach of their privacy, but they just said, you have to have an office here. You have to have someone that if we're upset at you, we can call up, and someone presumably if we're upset, which, the Turkish government loves to do, we can sue you.
And just today, the New York Times reported on how Russia has began throttling Twitter because it's unhappy with Twitter's policies in the country, not cracking down on accounts that the government has problems with. And so in some ways, it goes to a question that someone else asked earlier about what would it take for another platform to come out of nowhere and serve as a happy middle ground for all of this. It's really, really tough for any mainstream platform to do that at scale, because once you reach international scale, it's just a matter of time before you start requiring having a physical presence in a lot of countries. And even if you don't have a physical presence, if a government doesn't like what its citizens are saying on your platform, they can throttle it. And if you do have a presence there, by the government even acknowledging that you have staff working in that country, it's sometimes not a not so subtle threat that these individuals, yes, they could be sued, but perhaps even worse, they could be jailed. So in many ways, from the platform's perspective, I must imagine it's sort of a lose-lose scenario on how you extricate yourself from that. I certainly don't have an answer on how to do it.
Hundreds of accounts are blocked, and I regularly come across accounts in Turkey that are blocked. And there was one instance where the spokesman for the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria subtweeted an account with praise, and that account was blocked. It was a Kurdish-led militia. That account was blocked in Turkey. So you had a NATO partner tweeting a tweet from an account that was blocked in another NATO partner.
I think you all raised important points about the responsibility. Is there a responsibility for these companies to protect individuals, protect freedom of speech? These are all issues that we're grappling with more and more, especially in the aftermath of the events of January 6th and blocking of certain individuals, including former President Trump. One thing I do want to ask quickly is, there's this protest that emerged in Sudan, Algeria, that you referenced, Borzu, Lebanon, and Iraq in the past couple of years. Did some of those quote-unquote Arab Spring 2.0 protests learn from or leverage social media in the same way that the first protests did?
I would love to hear what others think about this as well, but I would say that in some ways they did learn, in that they weren't so dependent on social media. They were in Sudan, in Algeria. Algeria was a little different in that, you had a significant section of the elite, including the media, that were, covering what was happening pretty explicitly. But, the focus was not on, getting the message out via YouTube or Twitter or whatever. The focus was on organizing in the streets, holding the square. In Algeria, I've followed quite closely, and, whatever would happen, Fridays after prayers, you get out there, and they would, with determination go out there every Friday for weeks and weeks and weeks, even after. And then, like lessons learned were more political lessons. This is important. Bouteflika was gone. And, the generals were like, okay, go back home. And they learned a lesson from Egypt, which was no, don't go back home. Stay out, hold the square, hold Post Office Square in the case of Algiers. Continue to go out and keep protesting and so on. And I think the same lesson was learned in Lebanon and Iraq to a certain extent. Even after they try to offer you an olive branch, don't take it. Don't take the bait.
Yeah, I think Borzo is right. I mean, and going back to what you said earlier, I do agree with with social media having taken like more of people's attention at the time. But I mean, the bulk of the people who were really active, the most active in this, were 20-year-olds, and it was very new and it was very exciting, and you just got lost in the moment. So, I mean, we can't really blame them, but I do see, I mean, in retrospect, I do see what you're saying, and I think you do have a point there, yeah.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our time here, but we could certainly go on. I really appreciate all of your time, Rasha, Andy, Borzu. Thanks for enlightening us. I hope our audience will follow you all on Twitter and other social media platforms, because that's how we can share our work, unfortunately or fortunately. And please check out our websites and their publications. Thank you all for joining us. I also want to thank my colleagues from the Middle East program and DFR Lab, Sam, Ali, Kelsey, Eric, and Jacqueline, as well as Lauren and the IT team for all their support. Thanks, everyone. Tune in for other events with us at the Atlantic Council. Have a good afternoon.